The train groaned as it pulled into Deadwood Crossing, its smoke trailing like a weary sigh across the copper-streaked sky. Evening settled over the town in layers of gold and dust, the kind of light that made everything look older, lonelier, and more honest than it had any right to be. Horses shifted in their posts. Shop doors creaked, and the folks who had nothing better to do than watch other people's lives begin or end gathered by the depot, boots crunching grit, eyes sharp with habit. She stepped down from the second passenger car with a hand to her hat and her heart in her throat. Eleanor Mayfield, 24 years old and not a stranger to hunger or hope, carried herself like a woman who'd practiced dignity in front of cracked mirrors. Her dress was sage green cotton with careful stitching at the seams. Her boots were clean, and though her figure was full in the way some men whispered about, she held her back straight and her chin higher. In her gloved hand, she clutched the letter, the one from Mr. Eli Bracken, proprietor of Bracken's General Goods, who'd written with fine penmanship and promises of warmth, of steadiness, of a future shared. His last line had read, "I don't mind a sturdy woman. I need someone who can stand the winter with me." Eleanor had read it over and over on the train, the words softening her worry like butter on a skillet. She scanned the platform, eyes searching for that familiar signature in flesh. Eli was supposed to meet her at 6 sharp. She imagined him with a fresh-shaven jaw and clean boots, maybe a nervous hat in hand. Instead, a lanky man in a stiff brown vest sauntered forward, arms folded tight. His mustache twitched when he saw her. "You Eleanor Mayfield?" he asked, voice flat as a board. Eleanor gave a soft nod, smoothing the front of her dress with one hand. "I am. And you must be." His laugh cut through her words, a quick, sharp bark that made a few heads turn. "You gotta be joking." The words hit her like a slap, quiet but stinging. She blinked once, then again. Eli looked her up and down, not with confusion, but with calculated dismissal. "You didn't say you were." He waved a vague, lazy hand, built like a plow horse. A breath caught in her chest. She willed herself not to move, not to cry, not to let her face betray the fire building behind her ribs. "I'm strong," she said quietly. "I cook. I sew. I kept my family through a hard winter and 2 brothers in the war. I thought that was the sort of wife you wanted." He snorted. "Wanted a woman, not a wagon." His voice wasn't even angry, just small, coward small. Someone laughed. A cluster of boys, maybe 16 or 17, chuckled near the station door. One mimicked her walk with a puffed-out chest. Another elbowed his friend and said something about beef and baggage. She didn't look at them. She didn't look at Eli. She only looked at the dirt between her boots, then back the train. But the conductor had already shouted last call, and the wheels had begun to groan again. "I came all this way," she whispered. "I have no one back east. This was supposed to be." He shrugged. "A mistake." Eleanor turned then, slowly, because there was no dignity in running. She walked away from the platform with her satchel held tight to her side, not looking back, not letting her feet falter though her knees ached with shame. The town opened in front of her like a map she hadn't learned. A few stores with dark windows, a boarding house that wouldn't take charity, and a saloon that already had men spilling onto the porch with half-full glasses and quarter-empty hearts. She walked past them all. No one stopped her. No one welcomed her. By the time she reached the edge of the town, where the light turned blue and the road turned into silence, the tears had come. Quietly, like they didn't want to disturb her pride too much. She sat on a rock by the edge of the fence and let herself cry with her back to the town. Just for a minute. Just until the lump in her throat eased enough for her to breathe again. Behind her, laughter rose again from the depot. Somewhere in it was Eli's voice. She wiped her face with her sleeve and looked up at the stars. One by one, they had begun to appear, pale and flickering like distant promises. She watched them the way a child watches candle flames, as if one might suddenly burn brighter, might answer her. The wind picked up, brushing through her hair with the chill of coming night. Eleanor pulled her shawl tighter, took a breath, and stood. There'd be no room at the inn, no money to buy her way into someone's kitchen. But she'd find a place, even if it was a hayloft, even if it was the back of a church. because she'd survived worse than this. She turned her back on the town again, not knowing that someone had seen. Not the mocking boys, not Eli, but a man leaning against the post by the blacksmith shop. Long coat, dust on his boots, quiet eyes the color of overcast skies. He didn't speak, just watched as she disappeared down the road. And though he did not move, something in him stirred, something steady, like the first crack of spring through frozen soil. And just like that, the night took her in, a little battered, a little bruised, but still walking, still full of hope, even if it lived, now, only in her bones. The church sat on the hill just east of town, where the road turned narrow and gravel popped underfoot. Its white steeple rose like a reaching hand, faded by sun and season, but still proud. The front doors were locked after sundown, but the side shed, the one meant for broken pews and spare hymnals, had a loose latch Eleanor found in the dark. She crept inside and sank down onto the worn boards, the scent of old wood and candle wax rising to greet her. Mice stirred beneath the walls. Dust swirled in silver clouds, where moonlight found cracks in the roof. It wasn't home, but it wasn't the street either. She curled herself into the far corner, satchel beneath her head, shawl drawn tight against the cold that seeped up from the floor. Her boots throbbed with the ache of miles. Her stomach murmured from the long ride and longer shame. She prayed a little, not because she expected an answer, but because the silence needed something in it. At dawn, a rooster crowed in the distance, and footsteps crunched outside the door. Eleanor sat up straight, heart thudding, afraid she'd be told to leave, that even this scrap of shelter was too much to ask. But the door opened slow and gentle. A woman stepped inside, wrapped in a wool cloak the color of plum preserves, with an apron tied neatly beneath. Her gray-streaked hair was tucked in a bun, wisps framing a round, kind face. She carried a basket in one hand, a lantern in the other. "You're not the first girl to sleep here," she said, voice warm as bread just pulled from the oven. "And you won't be the last." Eleanor didn't speak. Her throat was too dry. The woman knelt and placed the basket beside her. "My name's Margaret Hargreaves. I'm the pastor's wife. I bring bread on Thursdays to old Mr. Knowles, and on Sundays I sweep this shed when no one else wants to. I saw your footprints last night. Figured you'd be cold come morning." Inside the basket was a loaf of cornbread, a small wedge of cheese wrapped in cloth, and a tin cup of warm broth. Eleanor stared at it like it might vanish if she moved too fast. "I don't have money," she whispered. "You're not buying anything," Margaret said simply. "You're eating." Eleanor took the bread first, breaking off small pieces with trembling fingers. She didn't realize she was crying again until one drop landed on the crust. Margaret said nothing of it. She just sat beside her in the quiet and let her eat. It wasn't long before the town started to notice her shadow in the corner of the church during Sunday service, or sweeping steps with Margaret in the early light, or singing low to the children when they grew restless in the pews. No one told her to leave, but no one asked her to stay either. She didn't mind the work. She washed linens, mended robes, scrubbed the altar steps. It gave her hands purpose and kept her from slipping too far inside herself. In the stillness between chores, she learned the rhythms of the town. Who came early, who always left just before the final hymn, which children ran barefoot, which mothers looked tired behind their Sunday smiles. And she saw him, the man from the shadows, the one who hadn't laughed at the train station. He came every third Sunday, sat in the back row, his frame folding neatly into the space like he didn't want to be noticed. He never sang, never bowed his head, just listened, eyes calm, still as a field before storm. Margaret caught her looking one day and said, "That's Thomas Lark. Lost his wife 2 winters ago. Doesn't say much, but he always brings firewood when we run low." Eleanor nodded, tucking his name like a folded letter into her thoughts. The next morning, he left a bundle of kindling by the shed door. No note, no knock. She stared at it for a long time before carrying it inside, the wood warm from sun. Days passed like pages in a quiet book. Eleanor stitched altar cloths in the chapel's back pew and hummed while she worked. The children started leaving her wildflowers in jars. One old man dropped coins into her apron when he thought no one noticed. It wasn't much, but it was beginning. Then came the day the rains rolled in from the west, low clouds dragging their bellies over the hills, wind howling through the cracks in the shed. Margaret insisted Eleanor come stay in the church proper for the night, but Eleanor shook her head. "I'm not someone folks want inside," she said softly. Margaret looked at her then, long and thoughtful. "They don't know what they want," she replied. "You just make them nervous. People are always nervous around women who keep standing when they've been knocked down." Later, Eleanor lay in the shed with a storm tapping the roof like fingers on a drum. She thought of her mother's voice, soft and strong. Thought of her brother's graves. Thought of how many times she'd carried things meant for others. She didn't hear the knock at first, but it came again, low and steady. She opened the door to find Thomas standing there, soaked from the rain, holding a folded canvas tarp. "Thought you could use this," he said. "Leaks bad tonight." She reached out, her fingers brushing his. "Thank you." He nodded once and turned to go, but then he paused. "You sing real pretty," he said without looking back. And then he was gone. Eleanor closed the door behind her, heart fluttering like a bird surprised by open sky. That night, she slept warm beneath canvas and dreamed of nothing. By morning, the storm had passed and the sun broke through like a promise. She swept the porch steps slow, listening to the wind hum through the bell tower. Thomas was out in the field. She could see him from her eyes. Walking with his head down, his stride steady. He didn't wave, but she smiled anyway. There was something in the way he moved, not urgent, not heavy, just certain. She wasn't sure what it meant yet, but for the first time in weeks, she wanted to find out. The rain came soft and steady that afternoon, soaking the hills in quiet silver. The town square smelled of wet hay, spice bread, and mud, September scent. Men strung lanterns across the barn eaves, while their wives laid pies on check tables under canvas tarps. Children splashed in puddles, skirts and trousers stained dark to the knees. There was music tuning up in the rafters, an old fiddle, a guitar with a cracked back, someone thumping boots for rhythm on the floorboards. Eleanor stood in the church vestibule, watching it all from behind the wavy glass of the window. Her hands trembled against the bodice of her dress, pale lavender with a soft neckline and buttons, so tiny her fingers had fumbled with them for nearly half an hour. Margaret had helped. She'd sewn it herself, using leftover bolts from the charity box, cutting and stitching in secret over the last few weeks. "You'll go," Margaret had insisted, "and you'll stand tall. Not for them, for you." But now, Eleanor wasn't sure. The memory of that train platform still lived in her chest like a bruise. Eli's laugh, the boy's mocking eyes, the way her stomach had clenched, hot and sick. She could still hear it in her ears, even now. She pressed a hand to her belly, not for vanity, but for grounding. Just breathe. Outside, the lanterns flickered on, warm light in the gray evening. The barn looked like something from a story, something good and clean and far away. She saw children chasing each other up the stairs, women brushing drops off their shoulders, the first chords of a reel beginning to rise. And then she saw him. Thomas Lark stood just outside the barn doors, hat in hand. His coat was plain. His boots were worn, but shined. He didn't fidget or speak. He just watched the road leading from the church. His posture was straight, his eyes fixed, as if he were waiting, as if he knew she'd come. Eleanor turned from the window. The walk to the barn wasn't long, but every step felt like miles. Her skirt clung to her ankles with each puddle she stepped through, the hem darkening. The townsfolk turned as she entered, some with surprise, others with something closer to discomfort. A few looked away. One woman near the pies whispered behind her gloved hand. But Thomas was there. He moved toward her, calm as ever, meeting her halfway across the floor. He didn't glance down at her dress, didn't study her curves or the way her damp hair clung to her cheeks. He just looked into her eyes. "Evenin'," he said, voice steady as creek stone. "Evenin'," she answered, chest tightening. "Thought maybe you wouldn't come." "I almost didn't." His lips curved into something quiet and sure. You look like rain in the desert." She laughed then. A small sound startled out of her. "That a compliment? It's the best one I've got." The music behind them swelled. A slow waltz now. Fiddle and low harmonies. He held out a hand. "I don't dance well," Eleanor said. "I don't mind." She placed her hand in his, and they moved. His steps were cautious at first, mindful of her rhythm, her pace. But he didn't lead with force. He listened with his body, shifted gently, and kept space enough for her to breathe. Around them, couples turned and watched. Some smiled, some didn't. But none of it reached Eleanor. It was Thomas's hand, warm around hers. His gaze, resting on her like sunrise. The smell of fresh earth and wood smoke that clung to his collar. She felt the tightness inside her loosen, thread by thread. Her laugh came again, softer this time, freer. When the song ended, they didn't leave the floor. They just stood together, the hush of the room falling like another kind of rain. He leaned a little closer, not bold, just near enough for her to hear the low roughness in his voice. "You got a fire inside, Eleanor Mayfield. The kind that keeps a man warm, if he's lucky." She looked away, shy suddenly. Most folk don't see it. They're looking wrong. The next song was faster, too fast for her taste, so she stepped back and offered a smile. "Mind if I catch my breath? I'll be right here." She crossed the floor to the side door, where a breeze cut through the warm barn air. Outside, the rain had slowed to a mist, curling through the dark like breath. She stepped out into it, needing a moment, needing space for all the feeling crowding her ribs. The air smelled of sage and damp pine. Lantern light spilled over the porch. Her reflection hovered in a puddle, dress clinging, curls loosened, eyes brighter than they'd been in months. She didn't hear the footsteps behind her until they stopped. "You think that little show changed anything?" The voice was low, bitter, soaked with drink. Familiar. Eleanor turned. Eli stood just inside the porch's edge, arms crossed, mouth twisted. His shirt was wrinkled, his tie loose. The woman on his arm earlier was nowhere in sight. "You're still the same girl who stepped off that train," he said. "And they'll remember that." Eleanor's voice didn't shake. "You're right. I am the same girl. But you're the one who made a fool of yourself." He took a step forward. "You trying to climb your way back up with that farmer? You think marrying quiet makes you clean again?" Before Eleanor could answer, a shadow moved across the porch. Thomas stepped into view, not rushing, not bristling, just there. Eli turned toward him with a sneer. "This about you now, Lark? You think picking up other men's scraps makes you some kind of saint?" Thomas didn't blink. "You need to go." "Or what?" Thomas didn't raise his voice. His jaw didn't tighten, but his eyes were cold as iron. "I won't ask twice." Something in his stillness made Eli flinch. He spat near the porch rail, muttered something Eleanor didn't catch, and stumbled down the steps into the mist. For a long moment, there was only the sound of water dripping from the eaves, and the low hum of the fiddle inside. Eleanor looked at Thomas. He was watching her, concern in his gaze, but no pity, just presence. "I'm sorry," she said, unsure why. He shook his head. "Don't be. That man doesn't define you." She looked down at her dress, soaked now along the edges. It's hard not to hear him sometimes. "I know." His voice gentled. "But he's wrong." She met his gaze, steady now. "You waited for me. I would have waited all night." She exhaled slowly. The ache of the moment passed through her and out into the mist. "Come inside," he said, offering his hand once more. Eleanor took it. Inside the barn, the music rose again, sweet and rich. They returned to the floor, and this time, her feet didn't falter. Winter arrived without warning, as it often did on the frontier, riding in on a north wind that bit through timber and soul alike. The first snowfall came on a Tuesday, soft as flour sifted from a mother's hands. By sundown, the ground was quiet under a white hush, and chimneys trailed smoke like prayers. Eleanor had moved into the spare room at the Lark homestead 2 weeks before the cold truly settled. It wasn't spoken of much, just something that made sense. The shed was no place for a woman in December, and Thomas had simply shown up one morning with his wagon, his hat low, and a quilt already folded in the back. "I got room," was all he said. And she climbed in not because she needed saving, but because the way he said it made her feel like staying wasn't a shameful thing. Life at the farm was simple, honest. They rose before light. Eleanor made bread while Thomas chopped wood. They passed each other like slow-moving rivers, side by side, never rushed. She hung laundry while snow fell around her like drifting feathers. He repaired the roof with his coat flapping in the wind, and his jaw set in that calm, sturdy way that made her feel anchored. They spoke in small phrases. "You need salt? I'll fix that shutter. Don't forget your scarf." But in the silences, something bloomed. In the evenings, Eleanor read beside the stove, her feet tucked beneath her. Thomas carved things from scrap wood, a bird, a small horse, once a cradle he wouldn't explain. Sometimes he looked at her like he wanted to speak, but didn't yet have the words. She didn't press. One night, after the first hard frost cracked the troughs and sealed the creek's edge, Eleanor stood outside in her shawl, watching the stars stretch over the hills. The sky was the color of bruised plums. Her breath clouded in front of her, drifting toward the barn. Behind her, the door creaked. Thomas stepped out, hands in his coat pockets. "You're going to freeze out here," he said. "I like the quiet." He nodded, came to stand beside her. "You miss the city?" She shook her head. There was no sky in the city, just smoke and noise. They stood in silence a while longer. Somewhere down in the trees, a coyote called and was answered. "You ever think about leaving?" she asked softly. "Sometimes," he said, "but there's a kind of peace in being needed." She looked at him, then really looked. How the moonlight softened the sharp lines of his face, how the snow caught in his hair. Her heart stirred in a way that frightened her. The next morning, she found her old brooch, her mother's, sitting on the kitchen table. The pin had been broken since she arrived, useless. Now it was whole again, polished, the clasp fitted neatly, with a new catch. She knew his hands had done that, knew it without asking. And with that quiet gift came the unspoken truth she'd been circling since autumn. He saw her, not as a burden, not as a woman trying to earn her keep, but as something treasured. One evening, as they cleaned up supper, Thomas stood by the hearth, hands braced on either side of the mantel. "I've been thinkin'," he said, voice even. Eleanor turned from the wash basin, drying her hands. He looked up at her, not with fear, but with care so sharp it made her breath catch. "You could stay," he said, "not just for winter." She didn't speak. The cloth in her hand stilled. "I mean, if you wanted," he added, "if this feels like home." Her heart thudded, not from surprise, but from the soft certainty she'd known this moment was coming. And now that it had, she found herself drifting between two thoughts. Could I stay? And what would make me leave? "I don't want to be something you're settling for," she said at last, her voice barely above the crackle of the fire. His brow furrowed. "You think that's what this is?" She looked down at her hands, still red from dishwater. "Most of my life, I've been reminded of what I'm too much of. Too big, too loud, too stubborn. I don't want to mistake kindness for something else." He crossed the room in 2 steps, stopped just short of touching her. "I never said it," he said slowly, "because I figured saying it too soon might cheapen it. But Eleanor, every day since you came here, it's felt like something set right again. You make the house warmer. You make me want to look up." She met his eyes. There was nothing hidden in them. No pity. No hesitation. Still, fear rose in her like cold water. What if I say yes, and you change your mind? What if someone else comes along, thinner, prettier? Someone who fits what this town thinks a bride should be. He stepped closer. "I've already seen the best thing I'll ever see. It's you. Standing right here. Not afraid to ask hard things." She trembled then, not from doubt, but because hope had crept in where sorrow used to live. Before she could answer, there came a knock at the door. Thomas frowned, moved to open it. A gust of snow followed the frame, along with a shadow Eleanor hadn't expected to see again. Eli Bracken, drunk, or close to it. His coat was buttoned crooked, and his eyes had the glassy sheen of someone used to being listened to, even when he made no sense. "Well now," he slurred, stepping in as if the house were his to enter. "Didn't expect to find her here." Eleanor stepped back instinctively, Thomas's arm shifting just slightly in front of her. Eli laughed. "What, you two playing house now? That what you wanted, Eleanor? Couldn't get me, so you took the farmer." "Leave," Thomas said quietly. But Eli didn't. He swaggered further inside. "Ain't that something? You really think he's gonna make you respectable? Look at you. Still soft as dough, still walking around like the world owes you comfort." Thomas's hand clenched. "You need to go," he said again. Eli turned to Eleanor then, smile bitter. "Don't you ever wonder if he just pities you? Your charity in a dress." Something in Eleanor flared. Sharp. Holy. She stepped forward, her voice calm but steeled. "No. I'm the one who survived. And he's the man who sees that." Eli's mouth twisted. "You really think anyone in this town will celebrate you?" Thomas moved then, not with violence, not with heat, but with authority. He took Eli by the shoulder and turned him toward the door, like he'd been hauling sacks of grain all his life. Eli protested, muttering curses, but within seconds he was back outside, stumbling through the snow, the door closing behind him with a heavy thud. Eleanor stood still, heart thudding. Thomas turned. "You all right?" She nodded. "I am now." He crossed to her, reached out, brushed a loose curl from her cheek. "My offer stands," he said. "To stay. To make this home." Eleanor looked around the room, at the patched curtains, the bread on the table, the fire still glowing despite the storm outside. And she knew the answer. She just didn't speak it yet. Not because she was unsure, but because the best things deserved to be said when the snow stopped and the world was listening. Snow fell on Christmas Eve like it was meant to, slow and endless, blanketing Deadwood Crossing in a hush so deep even the wind seemed reverent. Lamplight poured from the church windows and flickered across the packed square, where folks trudged through slush in boots polished just for the occasion. The barn behind the chapel had been strung with pine garlands and flickering candles, their flames dancing gold against red ribbons. Laughter drifted like smoke. Music crept through the cracks. Eleanor stood in front of the small mirror in the back room of the church, smoothing the same lavender dress she'd worn at the harvest dance. Margaret had rehemmed it since, added a row of white lace at the collar, and a few hand-stitched forget-me-nots near the sleeves. Her curls were pinned up soft, a few tendrils falling on purpose. The brooch, her mother's, gleamed at her throat. For a long moment she just breathed. "Are you ready?" Margaret's voice came from the doorway, soft and proud. "I think so." "You're not walking in there to prove anything," the older woman said gently. "You're walking in to be seen. And that's different." Eleanor smiled faintly. "I'm still afraid." "Good. Means your heart's open." Thomas waited for her by the barn doors, coat pressed, and his wild curls tamed into something almost proper. He didn't speak when he saw her, just exhaled like he'd been holding his breath all day. Then he offered his arm, and she took it, fingers curling against the crook of his elbow. They stepped inside together. The music softened. Heads turned. At first, there was only a hush, quick glances, eyebrows lifted, whispers under breath. Then something shifted. The pastor's wife gave a small clap. The blacksmith's daughter, who once watched Eleanor with pity, smiled wide. A boy tugged his mother's sleeve and whispered, "She looks like a queen." Not everyone clapped, but enough did. Eli stood by the back wall, his new bride already turned from him. He watched with a sour stillness, jaw clenched, hands loose at his sides. Eleanor didn't meet his eyes. She and Thomas walked to the front where a row of chairs had been cleared, and the pastor stepped up to speak. "Before we begin the hymn," he said, "I'd like to share a bit of joy that's found its way into this community." Eleanor's breath hitched. The pastor smiled. Two good souls found each other this season. Quietly, steadily, and if you'll forgive me, with more grace than most of us deserve. Thomas Lark and Miss Eleanor Mayfield are to be married in the new year. There was a pause. Then applause, full, warm, unhesitating. Eleanor felt it rush through her like a wind that didn't push but lifted. She blinked, tears catching in her lashes, and Thomas squeezed her hand once, firm and sure. Someone called for a song. Margaret nudged her. "Go on." Eleanor stood, heart pounding. Not with fear, with weight, with meaning. She walked to the front, hands folded, and began to sing. The first note trembled, the second held, and then the room leaned in. Her voice wasn't trained, wasn't perfect, but it was true. It carried the ache of nights spent in a shed and the warmth of firelight in a kitchen that wasn't hers until someone said stay. It held every quiet kindness, every cruel word survived, every thread of hope stitched into that lavender dress. When she finished, the room was still. Even the children stayed quiet. Then applause rose again, not polite this time, but real, deep from the chest, like it had been waiting. Afterward, people approached, not just out of ceremony, but sincerity. A woman pressed Eleanor's hand and said her song reminded her of her mother. A teen girl leaned close and whispered, "I always thought I was too big, but you looked so beautiful." Eleanor thanked each one with a soft smile, though her chest was full and trembling. Later, she and Thomas stood outside on the porch, watching snow tumble down like feathers from heaven. The church bells rang out midnight, and the town lit candles one by one. Their glows flickered in every window, a constellation of small mercies. Thomas turned to her, face flushed from firelight and cold. "You still afraid?" he asked. Eleanor thought about it. "No," she said, "not of being seen." He leaned down, brushing his lips to her forehead first, then her cheek, then lower, gentle, reverent. Not possession, but presence. As if saying, "You're not just wanted, you're loved." She wrapped her arms around him, burying her face in the wool of his coat. Behind them, the barn flickered with dancing shadows, voices lifted in song. But out here it was quiet, just the two of them beneath a sky full of stars. Eleanor breathed deep, the cold stinging her lungs in a way that reminded her she was alive, whole, wanted. She smiled into the night. She wasn't too much. She was exactly enough. And now, the town knew it too.